Okay. Okay, and with that, I would like to introduce Grover Wrenn, who, when we first started this idea, was the sub-chair of a committee of the finance committee that was looking at the long-term needs, financial viability of the church. And in the meantime, he's now on the First Plymouth Fund Board of Trustees. And so he's in a great position to talk to us about the fund and why it was established. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Grover, and please, everybody, mute yourselves.
Good morning. Thank you for your participation this morning and your interest in the First Plymouth Fund. As you know from recent announcements, there will be an information session on this topic tomorrow following worship, and a second session on Sunday, February 27th. And there will be a congregational meeting on March 20th to consider the recommendation of the board of the First Plymouth Foundation that the foundation be dissolved and the assets transferred to the First Plymouth Fund. The reason for the information sessions in preparation for a congregational meeting is that when the foundation was created by First Plymouth Church, all members of First Plymouth are members of the foundation.
All members of First Plymouth.
You're breaking up, Grover. I'm wondering, does somebody have their mic on?
Yeah,
Somebody have their mic.
Bruce, can you mute everyone? And you should have that capability. So in order to dissolve the foundation as recommended by the Board of
Grover is muted.
Yeah, Grover, we can't hear you at all.
Grover, you're muted, I'm afraid. Just a minute, go back a little.
Bruce, did you mute everybody?
I did, but I've tried to reverse that. Someone said mute all, and I canceled it.
Doesn't his name pop up? Oh, dear.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Well, I might have done that because someone said mute all, and I did.
Well,
Anyway.
I was having a hard time finding my unmute button with the presentation up. Okay, so we'll proceed from here. What I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is something that many of you are familiar with, but what is the First Plymouth Endowment? What is the First Plymouth Foundation? What is the First Plymouth Fund and why create it? Where did the assets come from that comprise these funds? And a little bit about the importance of planned gifts to First Plymouth. The idea for the First Plymouth Fund originated with the leaders of the Foundation Board and the Endowment Committee, and in particular, Denise Brown and Harry Adair. Those conversations began nearly 2 years ago. The recognition that we are facing challenges, significant financial challenges in the coming years, added impetus to the discussions, and it was felt that the church would benefit from managing these assets in a more strategic manner. So the thought arose to create a new fund called the First Plymouth Fund that would consist of the combined assets of the endowment and other assets administered by the endowment committee, including the brand fund and certain other funds, and the assets of the foundation. The First Plymouth Fund has been established by council at their January meeting by approving amendments to the financial policies and procedures developed by the Finance Committee to provide for the operation of the First Plymouth Fund. The purpose of the First Plymouth Fund is to provide a perpetual source of income from invested assets to support the mission and ministry of First Plymouth Congregational Church. The fund initially consists of the assets of the First Plymouth Endowment, the Huebner Fund, the Brand Family Improvement Fund, and other funds designated by council. The First Plymouth Foundation Board has recommended dissolution of the foundation and transfer of the assets to the fund. And that recommendation was unanimous and was expressed in 3 successive meetings of the foundation board. Here's a summary of the assets of the First Plymouth Fund, assuming the congregation approves the recommendation of the foundation board to dissolve the foundation and transfer those assets to the First Plymouth Fund. I've presented these in 2 categories, that is net assets without donor restrictions, which we commonly refer to as unrestricted funds. Those total almost $3 million. And net assets with donor restrictions, that is permanently restricted funds, which include the Brand Fund, the Turpin Fund, the Bailey Fund, Knight Fund, and total just over $2.5 million. So the total assets available for investment exceed $5.5 million. The First Plymouth Fund is administered by a board of trustees. The revised financial policies and procedures provide that the council shall appoint 5 to 7 members of First Plymouth as trustees, and additionally that the church treasurer will serve ex officio as a member of the board of trustees. These are the individuals initially appointed to serve as trustees of the First Plymouth Fund. And you'll notice that at the outset, although the terms are 3-year terms for trustees, for the initial trustees, the terms are staggered so that in subsequent years, as a trustee's term expires, only a couple of trustees will change each year, not the whole board. And the policies provide that a trustee may be appointed to a second term, but not beyond that. The duties of the trustees are the duties of fiduciaries, and specifically trustees are subject to the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutions Funds Act of September 1st, 2008, which is a Colorado statute. One of the duties is to retain an investment advisor. And in fact, about 10 days ago, the trustees met for about 3 hours to hear presentations from 2 candidate advisors. They are the advisors who have served for nearly 20 years or more in one case as advisors to the endowment, and separately as an advisor to the foundation. One of the benefits of having a single fund to manage the investment of these combined assets is that there will be some simplification of the management and oversight of the funds. Currently, each of these funds has an audit each year. There will only be need for a single audit in the future, and a single board to oversee the investment of these advisors, and there's some fee advantage because of the larger volume of assets under management and having a single advisor rather than two separate advisors. The trustees direct the investment and management of the assets and the disbursement of funds available for appropriation. There's a requirement to meet at least quarterly and to report annually to the congregation and to assure adherence to the First Plymouth investment policies. I'd like to emphasize that the role of the investment advisor is important. They are professional financial advisors and can bring value to the trustees in presenting recommendations for specific investments and the rationale for the asset allocation model. But the ultimate responsibility and authority for management of the assets rest with the trustees, or specifically with the church council, who are authorized to delegate this responsibility to the trustees. Investment policies are contained within the financial policies and procedures of First Plymouth, which are developed by the Finance Committee and approved by council. Under those policies, the Church Council has delegated responsibilities for investment management and oversight of the First Plymouth Fund to the trustees. The financial policies specify the types of investments that are permitted. Diversification of assets is required. And within the past couple of years, we've added a specific provision that requires environmental, social, and governance factors to be strongly considered by the trustees and investment advisor in selecting investments. Quarterly performance reviews are obtained and reviewed, but the focus is on long-term performance of the portfolio. So why create a new fund? The primary reason for combining the assets of the foundation and the endowment and brand fund in a single fund with First Plymouth Church as the recipient of an annual distribution of income from the unrestricted assets is to more effectively accomplish the stated goals of both the foundation and the endowment, which is to support the mission of First Plymouth Church. The First Plymouth Foundation was created in 1981 as a separate 501c3 organization. All members of First Plymouth are members of the foundation. The funding of the foundation initially resulted from a transfer of funds from First Plymouth Church. The mission of the foundation was stated as supporting the broader mission of First Plymouth Congregational Church. Specific activities may include operations of an inner city parish, housing for the elderly, scholarships for students attending seminary and those who seek a career in church service, funding of mission projects, projects of the United Church of Christ, and providing funds for capital improvements to the facilities of First Plymouth Congregational Church. The First Plymouth Endowment was established by Church Council on February 7th, 1999, in response to a bequest of $645,000 from the K. McHugh estate. The mission of the endowment was stated as supporting First Plymouth Church with an emphasis on internal programs and activities, as well as building maintenance and enhancements which support the mission and ministry of the church. The Endowment Committee has administered the General Endowment Fund and the Brand Family Improvement Fund. How will the fund benefit First Plymouth? First Plymouth is named as the recipient, named in the financial policies and procedures that establish the First Plymouth Fund, is named as the recipient of an annual distribution from the unrestricted funds to be incorporated in the operating budget and presented for approval by council and the congregation in accordance with the budget process. The annual distribution will be 5% of the average principal balance of the unrestricted funds for the previous 12 quarters. The policies also provide that from time to time, the trustees will review the distribution percentage with the investment advisor to determine if it is appropriate. The goal is to, insofar as possible, preserve the purchasing power of the principal, which means that the total investment return has to average the 5% distribution plus inflation. And generally that has been achieved over the life of these funds. The amount of the distribution for fiscal year 2023 will be approximately $150,000. Where did these assets come from? Contributions to the endowment and the foundation have been received from many donors over time in amounts ranging from a few $100s to major gifts of $645,212 from the K. McHugh Estate and $645,000 from the Katie Turpin Trust. Approximately $3,120,000 in total contributions to the endowment and foundation have been received. Additionally, investment income has been greater than the amount of distribution, so that has also added to the value of the assets. There must have been gifts and bequests before 1917, given the age of First Plymouth and its predecessor. But the bequest from Reverend Frank T. Bailey is the earliest gift of record of which I'm aware that is part of the assets of the foundation. Frank Bailey was pastor of Plymouth Congregational Church of Denver for 27 years, from 1890 to 1917. The Bailey Fund was established in 1918 with a bequest from Reverend Bailey's estate. Income from the fund is to encourage individuals to pursue careers in ministry, other religious employment, and social work. The fund provides loans or grants to students from First Plymouth or other churches in the Rocky Mountain Conference. As of the end of last year, the fund balance was $251,306. I want to read. It's been interesting to learn about some of these individuals who were members, or in this case, pastor of First Plymouth many years ago, and who live on in our community through the bequests that continue to support the mission of the church of which they were a part. I'd like to read Frank Bailey's obituary, which was titled, "Popular Denver Pastor Passes Away Sunday." Reverend Frank T. Bailey, pastor of the Plymouth Congregational Church of Denver for the past 27 years, passed away last Sunday evening after a few days' illness. Dr. Bailey was one of the best-known clergymen in the state and would be mourned by all who ever came in contact with him. Dr. Bailey gave the principal address of the commencement exercises of the Lafayette High School last May, and previous to that spoke at a meeting of the Parent Teachers Association of this place. Everyone enjoyed his talks, which were among the most interesting and instructive ever heard in Lafayette. And those who were fortunate enough to become personally acquainted with him say that he was one of the best and finest Christian men to be found anywhere. The Lafayette Leader, Lafayette, Colorado, November 2nd, 1917. Frank Tappan Bailey, D.D., Colorado College, LLD, Denver University. Born 19 August 1846, Boston, Massachusetts. Bowdoin, 1867 to 69. 6th Massachusetts Infantry, 1864. Union Theological Seminary, 1873. Pastor, Brooklyn, New York, 1870 to 73. Canandaigua, New York, 1873 to 78. Detroit, Michigan, 1878 to 1883. Portland, Maine, 1833 to 91. Denver, Colorado, 1891 to 1917. And he lives on with us. Contributions to the foundation began with the transfer of the Bailey Fund and certain other assets to the foundation when it was established. The total contributions to the foundation since 1983 are $1,620,578. Total grants made, $1.6 million. And the fund balance at December 31st, 2021 was $3.4 million. So these are gifts that keep on giving. And this is the power of gifts and bequests that are held in investment and the income used to support the mission of the church. Here's a list of gifts to the foundation of $50,000 or more. There have been a total of 65 donors who've contributed to the foundation, but these are gifts of $50,000 or more, and many of you probably know a number of these donors. The endowment was created by a number of estate gifts and other contributions. The gifts have ranged from $5,000 to $645,000 and totaled nearly $800,000. Here's a list of some of those gifts. The total contributions to the endowment since 1999 are $800,000. Total grants made almost $700,000. And the fund balance at December 31st, 2021, $951,000. Again, gifts that keep on giving. This isn't the happiest part of the presentation. Since 2012, contributions to the endowment and the foundation have been minimal, which may reflect the lack of emphasis on planned giving. The endowment has received gifts of $17,631. The foundation, a gift of $4,000. The church's financial policy provides that bequests of $10,000 or less are to be incorporated in the operating budget. We did receive one unrestricted bequest of $120,000 about 3 years ago. And at that time, we were looking at challenges of achieving the balanced budget. COVID was dawning, and we had no way of anticipating the government grants that were going to be received. And that $120,000 with council's consent remains unallocated and has been maintained as I call it in accounting terms, a cookie jar reserve as contingent revenue during the COVID crisis. It looks like we may make it through this year again without having to utilize that bequest for the operating budget because of unexpected government grants. It's kind of ironic to say that our church is being kept afloat financially by grants from the federal and the state government. The Huebner Fund. The Huebner Fund is a temporarily restricted fund established by council in honor of the donors I don't have a precise record of this, but I understand that the donor's gift was $400,000. Don't know what it was utilized for, but $80,000 was set aside for a named gift in their honor, which is an unrestricted fund, but council temporarily restricted it to be used to support outreach projects and organizations as determined by the outreach committee. The value of the Huebner Fund was $103,000 as of December 31st, 2021. Of that amount, actually, $21,000 is available for appropriation by outreach. My understanding is that the timing of this was coincident with the decision to remove a budgeted appropriation for outreach from the operating budget and establish the Share the Plate program. And the Huebner Fund was created as an additional source of funding for outreach activities. This is an interesting one. The Brand Family Improvement Fund was established in 2000 with a bequest of $686,000 from Irene Morris Brand, who had been a member of First Plymouth since 1981. Income from the Brand Fund is utilized for improvements to the building, furnishings, and equipment of First Plymouth Church. The value of the fund was $1,050,000 as of December 31st. And under the terms of the donor restrictions, $30,000 is available to allocate in 2022. The first grant approved by the new Board of Trustees of the First Plymouth Fund was $9,600 to fill potholes in the parking lot, which will take place in the spring. Irene Morris Brand. The obituary was titled NORAD Secretary 89. Irene Morris Brand of Littleton, a retired North American Aerospace Defense Command Executive Secretary, died Thursday at Red Rocks Healthcare Center. She was 89. Services will be at 11 a.m. Tuesday at First Plymouth Congregational Church Chapel. Graveside services will be in Evergreen Cemetery, Colorado Springs. She was born August 30th, 1910, near Bethel, Missouri. She moved to Colorado Springs in 1921. She graduated from Blair Business College in Colorado Springs. On May 10th, 1933, she married Frederick William Brand. He died in 1993. She had been a member of the First Christian Church Disciples of Christ. During World War II, she worked in the church's soldiers program. She was a piano and organ soloist for many years and sang in the choir. She had been an auditor's assistant at First National Bank and was later executive secretary and administrative assistant to the deputy chief of staff for intelligence with NORAD. She retired in 1972 after 22 years. She was a charter member and past president of the Colorado Springs chapter of Pilot Club International. She was also a member of Women's Fellowship and Home Circle and past president of the Colony Club of First Plymouth Congregational, a church she joined in 1981. There are no immediate survivors. Her will was quite simple. She made provision for gifts to 4 couples and individuals in amounts ranging from $20,000 to $25,000. She made bequest of $10,000 each to the Shepard's Eye Research Institute to be used for macular degeneration research, $10,000 to the American Parkinson's Disease Association, $10,000 to the American Heart Association, $10,000 to the Arthritis Foundation, and $10,000 to the University of Colorado Foundation for the benefit of the Norland Library in memory of her daughter, Mary Lou Brand, RN, and $20,000 to the church in the Wildwood in Green Mountain Falls, Colorado. And then she gives, devises, and bequeaths all the rest, residue, and remainder of my entire estate to First Plymouth Congregational Church, United Church of Christ. And that residual amount was $686,000. Another gift that keeps on giving, and Irene Brand will continue to be a part of the First Plymouth community for as long as there is a First Plymouth community.
Hey, Grover, when did she die, did you say?
1999.
Well, I never knew her at all. Yeah. Thank you.
Let's see. The brand, oh, next. The Turpin Fund was established in 1998 by a bequest of $645,000 from the Katie L. Turpin Irrevocable Trust. The income from these funds is to be used for the religious education and training of young people for the church ministry. Most of the distributions from the Turpin Trust have supported students at ILF. ILF has a full page on their website describing their relationship with First Plymouth and the gifts from First Plymouth that have supported their students. Some of our interns from ILF have been supported by the Turpin Fund. Gifts to ILF have totaled $287,000. It's the largest single recipient of funding from the foundation over the years. The value of the fund as of December 31st, 2021 was $1.25 million. The Cornerstone Society was established by council in November 2013 to encourage members to consider including First Plymouth in their estate planning. Members of the Cornerstone Society are those who have indicated that they have made provision for a gift to First Plymouth in their estate plans. In 2014 and 15 families indicated that they had included First Plymouth in their estate plans. With the establishment of the First Plymouth Fund, it's expected that there will be a renewed focus on planned giving. Question: have you considered First Plymouth in your estate plan? That concludes my presentation, and look forward to our discussion. There are a number of you on this call who have much more firsthand knowledge of some of these events and history than I do, and I look forward to learning from that.
Hey, Grover, do you want to stop screen sharing and then we can all see each other?
Yes.
Maybe. And so, yeah.
I have a question. I keep reading about 5% of this being available to the church, which comes out to, I think you said $150,000. 5% of what? Because that's out of $5 million, that's not very much. So how does
First Plymouth is the recipient of an annual distribution from the unrestricted funds. The restricted funds will continue to be managed in conformance with the donor's directions. And it is possible that some of the distribution from the Brand Fund, for example, is a permanently restricted fund, but First Plymouth is the beneficiary. That $30,000 to $50,000 a year from the Brand Fund is not included in the $150,000. The $150,000 is simply roughly 5% of the unrestricted funds average balance over the past 12 quarters.
If you want to ask a question, either raise your hand or use that little reaction thing and put the symbol up in on your screen. The little yellow hand. I guess I'll ask a question, Grover. I asked this of Carol at a facilities meeting, I guess it was. I was surprised to see that the foundation's original purpose included capital improvements to the building. And so we're fortunate in facilities because we have the Wrenn fund to tap into. But, you know, we're facing a lot of big expenses coming down the road, and that $30,000 might not go very far. So I was wondering if facilities, for instance, could apply or put a request into the budget process to use some of the unrestricted funds. Carol said no.
Well, I don't think the no is an absolute no. I certainly invite Harry, who has firsthand knowledge of this, to contribute to this discussion. But if you look at a detailed list of grants made by the foundation and endowment over the years of their existence, you would be hard pressed to say that any one of the grants was an inappropriate decision. But the process that was established was what I call a passive process. The foundation board and the endowment committee were not pursuing specific goals on behalf of the church in allocating the funds available for distribution. They were responding to grant applications that came in over the transom. Individuals who were familiar, individuals or organizations in the church or outside the church, who were familiar with the availability of grants from the endowment or the foundation, would submit a grant application. It would be considered and either awarded or not. There were years in which the endowment, this may be true for the foundation as well, there were years in which the endowment did not distribute the funding that was available to be allocated, simply because they didn't receive grant applications that added up to the available funds. But the important thing, and I think this is what really initiated the discussion between Denise and Craig, was that these assets were not being managed in a strategic way consistent with the larger mission and purpose of First Plymouth. They were being administered on behalf of First Plymouth, but not consistent with the strategic objectives of the church. And that was what began the discussion about creating the First Plymouth Fund. And then those talks intensified and accelerated as we began to see looming budget challenges of larger proportion arising in the near term. Partly due to COVID, the impacts of COVID, and partly because of an aging donor base, and partly because of a 60-year-old building that was built for a congregation 3 times our size that was requiring an increasing portion of our revenue to maintain it.
Grover, a question in terms, you mentioned some of these funds have restrictions, and that those restrictions to a degree will be in place. How will you manage that?
Well, essentially the same way it's been managed in the past. The restrictions are well known. They're spelled out, and the funds will be used for those purposes. The brand fund is easy. Just clear and explicit purpose stated by Irene Brand was for improvements to the facilities, furnishings, equipment of First Plymouth Church. So it's the endowment committee has typically given great deference to the recommendations of the Facilities Committee as to how to apply those funds.
But I guess part of what I hate, they presume I'm not a financial type, so I'm having difficulty understanding how those will be represented in the overall fund.
Well,
Does that make sense to you?
You might think of it as a fund of funds.
Okay, all right, that makes sense then.
Hey, Grover, I got one other question, kind of a technical point, but way back when I was moderator, and Harry might remember this too, I thought the First Plymouth Foundation was 100% external to First Plymouth Church. And the description you gave showed that it was making some grants to First Plymouth capital improvement projects, but I thought it was, that was the old John Lowe project, as I remember. And I thought it was, and it was real frustrating to work with them, but it was nothing other than external grants. And you're right, it was all reactionary people coming in. So I don't think they ever did anything for the church itself. Am I wrong, Harry, or do you remember?
Well, the foundation did make grants to First Plymouth on a number of occasions. In fact,
Okay.
it made a large grant to the building, to the capital campaign.
Well, that was all after I was in, yeah, okay, maybe that changed after a while.
Oh, I understand, as a still a relatively newcomer to this group, that the history of creating the foundation was the desire on some of the people who supported creating the foundation to have control of the allocation of grants from that foundation for outreach activities that escaped the bureaucracy of the church. But I read you the actual mission statement of the fund, which is really quite broad. And if you look at the history of grant making, there really was a considerable portion of the grants that went directly to First Plymouth internal programs and First Plymouth Church operations.
Okay, thank you. I stand corrected.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that too. Yeah.
When I was moderator, it was really considered the John Lowe Fund, actually.
Hey, Grover, could you talk a little bit about all the so-called lesser funds and monies that are not, I think, in this fund, like Creation Justice has a nice little lot of money, and the Men's Fellowship and places like that. So they're not included, right?
Right. There are a large number of what are called in accounting parlance temporarily restricted funds related to specific CAMs, committees, or other activities within the church. Some of them are quite small, $200 or $300. Others larger. The sum total is not insignificant, but those funds remain on the balance sheet of First Plymouth Church and are administered by the Director of Administration as the funds are called for by the CAM or committee to cover expenses of particular activities.
Do they earn interest at all? Or?
Yes. But because they are subject to being called in the relatively short term, they are not invested in like long-term investments, which can suffer the volatility of the marketplace. They're kept in more liquid accounts.
But the fund doesn't get the benefit of that interest, do they? I mean,
No.
Our funds are our fund, right?
The church gets the benefit,
Yeah, right.
but not the First Plymouth Fund.
Mary Lee,
You're muted.
but go ahead and ask the question.
I'm looking at the Hubner Fund that's being incorporated in all this, and the 21,000 more or less that's available for outreach outside of the share of the plate. when that 21,000 is gone, then does future distributions have to come a request through council or through the new fund for additional funds to give? Does that make sense?
Yes, the Hebner Fund is administered in a unique manner. All of the other restricted funds, the permanently restricted funds, are required to preserve the purchasing power of the initial bequest.
Mhm.
So there's a moderately complicated calculation that you have to go through each year to determine how much is of it. It's not just a simple percentage of the value of the assets. You have to account for inflation. And if inflation is going up, as it is in this period, it has an adverse effect on the amount of the distribution that can be made. The Hebner Fund is a temporarily restricted fund, and council established as a rule for that outreach could spend any amount in the fund over the initial contribution, which was 80,000, and then 2,000 was added to it. So any amount of the balance over $82,000 can be spent.
Mm.
Once that's spent, then you got to wait for additional income to be earned on that invested $82,000. So for example, in this inflationary period, who knows what's going to happen, but if outreach were to spend that $21,000 and reduce the balance to the $82,000, and then the value of that $82,000 as it's invested were to go down, it could be that there would be a year in which there was no distribution available from the Hebner Fund.
Okay.
Doug Brown has his hand up.
Yeah, let's see if I can. At any rate, I'm sorry, I wasn't here when you ended your presentation, Grover, but and maybe somebody's already asked this question, but and today may not be the right time to talk about this, but at some point in our conversations about this, I'd be interested in an explanation of selection process for the new Board of Trustees, who nominated them, how they were selected, and how much knowledge there was in the congregation about and you can't tell me that because I know we never know how much knowledge there is in the congregation, but what were the efforts made to be sure that this process of selection of people and who was eligible for it and how people were nominated, how widely that was disseminated?
I don't recall any congregation-wide announcement being made or solicitation of expressions of interest. It was handled entirely by council, which has the responsibility of appointing the trustees. And I think if you look at the makeup of the trustees, there are some who had served on endowment, some who had served on the foundation, and others who had not. So it was a process conducted by council over a period of several weeks, discussion among members of council, and their conversation with potential candidates to confirm willingness to serve, and then the appointments were made.
Thanks.
Harry.
Well, I think
I just want to make a statement about the difference between donor restricted funds and council restricted funds. Council can restrict money for a particular purpose. Correspondingly, council can undesignate if they so choose. So in the case of the Huebner Fund, getting back to Mary Lee's question, the Huebner Fund was designated by council in the amount of that 80,000 plus an additional 2,000. So if outreach decided that there was a compelling reason to do something beyond that available, for example, $21,000, theoretically, outreach could go to council and say, we would like to draw down below that $82,000 because this is such an important project that we would like to undertake. So it's possible that outreach could have more money available. It's just that with the terms of the original designation, that's not currently possible.
So I had muted myself and I had asked Steve to unmute himself, but now Steve, do you have a question?
Yeah, as a newer member of the church, and I don't have all the history that everyone has, but I'm familiar with some of what endowment and foundation does. I've read the letter that came out through the emails, and I'm just a bit confused. I mean, I understand that the church has some financial troubles, and so this is to achieve some financial stability looking ahead, because if things stay the way they are, there's a potential for more financial distress. But in the letter, and from what I heard from the presentation here, it seems like the foundation is going away, but now being called the First Plymouth Fund. I'm confused as to why doesn't the foundation just change its operating rules? Why do we need to create a new entity and go through this whole process? What is being combined besides the foundation? Because it sounds like, you know, a lot of times when I've seen this before where people try and get around the intention of something by, oh, let's title something and then we'll incorporate other things that had restrictions into it. So besides the foundation coming into the First Plymouth Fund, what else is coming into it?
The assets of the, well, that's a good question. And I'd like to answer more than just that last question about the assets. But the other assets in the First Plymouth Fund are those that were in the endowment, almost $1 million there, and the brand fund, and other assets that council may designate for inclusion in the First Plymouth Fund. Certainly one option would have been to combine the assets of the endowment and the brand fund into the foundation and make that the single entity for overseeing all of the long-term investments of First Plymouth Church that were designed to support the mission of First Plymouth. But a foundation is a much more complicated and burdensome entity to administer than a fund of First Plymouth Church. There are freedoms and flexibility available for the kind of investments you can make through a foundation. But First Plymouth has no inclination or desire to use those freedoms. We're a pretty conservative investor. And a foundation can pay director fees to its directors. We have no intention of paying our volunteer members director fees. A foundation has to submit an IRS Form 990 each year, which is all foundations have to do this, but it takes a lot of time and effort and expense. So in thinking about the options available for achieving a single entity to oversee the investment and administration of our invested funds. Having a First Plymouth Fund, which is simply an entity of First Plymouth Church on its balance sheet with rules for administering those assets, is a very much simpler way of achieving that than to maintain the foundation.
Okay, so so the endowment then is going away, and the management for the endowment will be combined into this too. Let's use one of these funds for an example. So like the Turpin Fund, which was very specific that it was supposed to be used for the education of religious education for folks, and that was pretty much very specific in a restricted fund. So will the Turpin Fund go into the First Plymouth Fund, but be by the financial, whoever is running the investments, be held as a separate entity, and that its monies that then will be calculated, will be left out specifically of that 5% calculation, because that money is specifically supposed to be used for something other than what I'm hearing the First Plymouth Fund is supposed to do.
Correct. Think of the First Plymouth Fund as plural rather than singular. It is a fund of funds. It is a fund that really consists of multiple funds, some of which are unrestricted and some of which are donor restricted funds. The assets of the donor restricted funds may be commingled with the assets of the unrestricted funds for investment purposes, but you have to maintain a separate accounting for the individual donor restricted funds. And grants of income from those funds have to be made in accordance with the donor's restrictions.
Okay, so the Turpin Fund will be under this, along with all these other funds that you were speaking of will fall under the First Plymouth Fund?
Correct.
Okay, one last question. With different ministries within the church, whether it's Creation Justice or WISE or whatever, sometimes there's a project that is more than what that ministry has funding for. And so typically what happens is people will say, well, I know someone in endowments, or I know someone at the foundation, or why don't I go here? It sounds like this becomes just one place to go from here on out.
Correct.
Would be this current board. So I think it's real important, the question that Doug asked earlier, because this board then is going to it's a much more consolidated board. So the membership of this board, is really important that they are balanced. And I think this is very important to be transparent within a congregational environment. I'll listen to your response, and that's my last question. Thank you.
Wait a minute, I think Grover's going to answer the question.
I think there are two answers to your question, Steve. If Creation Justice, for example, to use that example, had a project that required funding beyond what was currently available in its temporarily restricted fund, last year, you could have gone to the endowment, or you could have gone to the foundation to seek a grant of funds for that project. And more than likely, those grants would have come out of the income from unrestricted funds that they were free to administer for that purpose. Now those funds from the First Plymouth Fund, the income from the unrestricted funds, will go to First Plymouth Church to be incorporated in the operating budget. And Creation Justice would submit its proposed budget request during the spring when the operating budget is prepared. And that budget request would be considered in relation to all of the other needs on the table at the time that the administration and the finance team and council were looking at to determine what could be fulfilled. To me, that's a more small d democratic process because it ultimately involves the approval by the congregation. The operating budget gets submitted twice to the congregation for approval after review by the finance team and council. The preliminary budget in June and then the final budget at the annual meeting in September. So I think there will be greater transparency because all of this will be taking place in the full view of the budgeting process. And additionally, transparency will be achieved by the annual report required. Now, in the past, both the endowment and the foundation have submitted annual reports to the church, which are printed in the annual report issued at the time of the annual meeting each year.
So I'm going to turn to my right and ask, Adrian wants to ask a question here.
Yeah, actually, an explanation may be helpful. There was during my tenure and for many years, the foundation was run by the president of the foundation, who was John Lowe. And I had mentioned earlier that it was considered the John Lowe Fund because he really determined where the money was going to go. So as president, or when you're moderator, you serve as a member of the foundation. After I finished my tenure and Scott Landis became our new minister, I explained the status of the foundation and how it was run, and suggested that perhaps he would want to consider the possibility of the church establishing a different fund as well. And that turned out to be the endowment fund. So that's why there are two. And it followed from there.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes,
Who's
talking? Oh, Craig. No?
Yeah.
Right.
I was on the fund when I was a moderator, and I'd have to say my experience was different from Adrian's. John was the one who ran the meetings, but we all voted on where this money was to go and looked at the applications that came in. So I didn't consider it to be something that was strictly dictated to by John Lowe. He was just one of the members, at least for the year or two that I was on it. But I was only on it, like Adrian, as because I was moderator, and I'm sure it had different. I suppose the way any committee is run is not only made up of a consideration of if you have a president for life, as the foundation did, which probably isn't very healthy, versus who else is on the committee and whether they tend to be strong voices or whether they tend to be passive voices. And so I'm sure over the years, the dynamics of the foundation changed depending on who was on it.
Dick has his hand up.
Just a comment. Moderators being members of the Lowe Foundation must have happened after my term as moderator, because I was never involved with that. And that change, Craig, may have taken place to moderate John Lowe's influence. Just a surmise on my part.
I think it did exist then, Dick, but no one wanted to tell you about it. They just didn't want you on the foundation.
It was only set up in 81, and that was probably after your time.
That indeed it was post.
I'd like to go back to the question Steve had earlier. let's say Creation Justice gets its budget approved and has, I don't know, $100,000 to spend during the year. And in June, they come along with a fantastic new project that they don't have money for. Do they then go to the First Plymouth Fund and ask for an additional grant? I think that's maybe what Steve was sort of getting at, or at least I didn't quite hear an answer to that.
The First Plymouth Fund will not be making grants from the income from unrestricted funds. That income will go to the church and will be allocated in the budget process. So the budget process will allocate those funds. If there were a restricted fund within the First Plymouth Fund whose restrictions included the activities that Creation Justice was interested in pursuing, then they could go to the First Plymouth Fund and seek a grant.
Okay, thank you.
Grover, a year is a long time. In fact, a year plus when you first do the budgeting process. Is there any allowance for, emergencies that come out during the year? You're going to have like a contingency fund for emergencies, or?
In the years I've been at First Plymouth, it has not been the practice of the Finance Committee to include a contingency sum in the operating budget. Some organizations do that, but we've just dealt with emergencies when they arise and reallocating funds. But we don't do contingency budgeting.
So
With one exception, which you're very familiar with. I would run the brand fund distribution through the operating budget and increase the budgeted amount by that amount for maintenance and operation of the facility. But the history has been, and I didn't win that argument, the history has been that the brand fund is held to cover unbudgeted expenses that arise during the year related to the facility.
right, and we're probably the ones that have the greatest emergencies,
Right.
i.e. the parking lot and the roof and so forth. But the smaller groups like the adult ed, it'd be hard for them to anticipate all their needs for the coming year, or not, or do you really make them budget their whole year in advance?
I'm having a hard time resisting my cute response. What do they need? Juice and cookies?
Oh, no, they have honorariums that they give out to people.
Oh,
Come and
oh.
talk.
It's called planning ahead.
Right.
Yeah, I know hopefully we all will do that, but that a lot of the stuff comes in over the transom, as you say. We could take a hard look at that kind of thing now.
Well, we've had some, we do not know how COVID has impacted the financial operations of the church in the coming years. You know that we received grants from the payroll protection program. We've received let's see, the sum total must be over $300,000 by now. We are essentially promised another grant this year of $89,000, which is kind of a refund of payroll taxes for those employees we kept employed during the COVID era. The Learning Center just received a $123,000 grant from the state of Colorado, totally unanticipated. Now, Noni and Carol applied for it, and it can be used for a wide variety of purposes. And the Learning Center is currently generating net income, and that net income is expected to increase significantly next year because they're raising tuition and enrollment. So we've had some good breaks during the COVID period. We also lost a significant part of our pledge income last year. We lost a couple of major donors, and we won't see that income again. We are losing, but just because of the demographics of our donor base, we're losing pledgers more rapidly than they are being replaced. We've had almost 3 years of relative inability to conduct new member programs. We were getting $30,000 to $40,000 a year in pledges from new members coming in on a routine basis during the years I was serving as chair or co-chair of stewardship. And we have had a very limited ability to undertake those activities during the restrictions of COVID. So it looks like these unexpected one-time grants from the government are helping us skate through this difficult period. We don't really know what's on the other side as we start returning to normalcy and those kind of supports go away, and we're left to our own devices.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions? Well, this has been a terrific present. Oh, Doug, do you unmute?
Steve had his hand up. Steve
Oh,
Barber.
I see that. I'm sorry. Good point. Steve Barber again.
Yeah, I just had one more on the same subject I was talking about earlier when there was some clarification made, but then I got confused again. So there is still a possibility of, say, Wise Ministry wants to put on classes for mental health. Okay. And that just became available because a local college or a local facility basically said, we're willing to do this. And, we'll come out and teach and it'll be in 2 months. Obviously that can't go through a budgetary process. Wise doesn't have a budget. So did I hear that there still is an availability of going to someone within the church for a grant process? Is that what someone had said, or is that not true?
Based on about 10 years experience on the finance committee, I would say we have relatively limited flexibility to spend on unbudgeted activities in the middle of the year. We're really dependent upon anticipation and planning and incorporation of those items in our budget. Of course, like most churches and other volunteer organizations, it's always possible to reach out to membership and solicit contributions to support an activity that is deemed, valuable, consistent with our mission, our values, and the kind of thing you're talking about is not a capital campaign. It's probably a few $1,000s, and we have individuals who from time to time step forward and agree to fund an activity they feel supportive of that has not been included within the budget. So that's always a possibility as well.
I'm just trying to think of the practicality of when we have these meetings like once a month with these various ministries like Wise and Creation Justice and others, Rhett, and we talk about potential projects that we'd like to do. Well, don't you think we should do this? This would be the next step. It sounds like this is going to influence. I mean, as a member of Wise, I'm going to recommend to them based on this that they need to put in a budget request. They don't have a budget request as far as I know right now. Neither does Creation Justice. But Creation Justice, if they just stay within their own budget, there is some funding there. But say they want to do something big, which is what a lot of these donations we're given, and the idea of reaching, and Jenny has a strong mission about reaching out into the community. And this feels to me, I mean, I understand the importance of protecting our financial health, but at the same time, in a time where, as you mentioned, we need to reach out in the community and start bringing in new members, and this almost feels really constricting, like limiting that outreach. And a lot of these donations, the larger ones, were given with the idea of reaching out into the community. But what I foresee then would be the groups would need to apply for budgets, all of them. Otherwise, it's just gonna be groups that meet and say, wouldn't it be nice if we did something? Because there's very little you can do that doesn't cost something. Or we're down to everyone running fundraisers, everyone trying to get at $5 and $10 at the door at service, to fund our small ministries. And that, I can tell you, that just doesn't work. It's nice to get $200 or $300, but you're not going to fund a course or have an impact with an outside organization. So my next question would be, since I don't know this budgeting process, when does a group like WISE or Creation Justice need to put in a budget request?
It's usually in March.
Wow, right away. Okay.
This is a good time to bring this up, Steve, if you have a specific project that you think is going to go.
Well, Creation Justice wants to do a whole recycling program, starting with Ready to Work, to go reaching out to that organization and teach them how to recycle. And part of that is so that, there's going to be some expense with that. And then we're using that as a foundation for then reaching out to like Second Chance and other organizations to be, reach out to these community organizations. We'll interact with them and we'll teach them about recycling. WISE wants to do some mental health education. So if we're going to do something like for the next year, otherwise we're just going to meet and say, well, it'd be nice we could do this if we had some money, but budget zero.
Steve,
Doug?
you could approach outreach. We have grants that are separate from Share the Plate.
Okay, so that's what I was trying to get at earlier. So outreach is still going to exist. This isn't going to affect outreach whatsoever.
Correct.
Of course.
Well, not having the background here, it wasn't of course to me, but that's good to know.
Yeah.
I'll keep that in mind. That's where to go now, and not foundation or endowment.
Okay, I can tell you we're not exactly loaded with money, but we would certainly consider it.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's one of the reasons we're having a good meeting here, to exchange some ideas and get educated. And Susie has her hand up.
I had the privilege and honor of attending Mission Team this month as the new chair of the stewardship campaign for this year. And I appreciate your comments, Steve, because if it's okay with you, Bruce, Mission Team needs all its CAM chairs who come to Mission Team once a month to be well aware of this budgeting process. Now, I think some of the CAM chairs who were at Mission Team were aware of the need to do a budget, but Steve, you're right. It needs to be impressed that you need to try and plan ahead. And maybe if you think you're going to have a speaker later in the year and you'd like to offer a small honorarium, usually people don't take it. But if you would like to do that, or you want a special reception, put it in your budget. Many organizations have budgeting processes and ask people to try and plan ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just making sure people know they need to do it.
This is new.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do?
Okay, does anybody else have a question? If not, I really want to thank Grover for coming and leading a very interesting discussion and an educational discussion about where the money comes from and where it goes. And I'm sure this will be continued tomorrow on it's not adult ed, it's a meeting, as I understand it, you stay in the sanctuary and it'll just be a continuation of the church service really, and again on the 2 weeks after that. So
Will that be the same presentation you just gave, Grover, or something different?
No, it'll be different people and different presentation. In the letter that went out to the congregation, as Steve indicated earlier in his remarks, there was an emphasis on the financial challenges that we perceive lying ahead as the primary impetus for creating the first Plymouth Fund. I think that's historically incorrect. It was really the conversations that began between Harry and Denise 2 years ago, before we had done the 5-year financial projections, that said, we can be better stewards of these resources than we are under the current organization and processes we were following for grant making. Let's think about doing it in a different manner. That's where it began, as the question of how to better manage these assets for the benefit of First Plymouth Church and its mission. And then we began to see the additional benefits that would come from First Plymouth being the recipient of the income from the unrestricted funds as part of its operations. And essentially making the grant decisions within the budget process.
I just checked on the calendar, make a quick point. Tomorrow's meeting will be on YouTube, which means if you can't come, you won't be able to ask questions.
There's a chat feature on YouTube that allows you to ask questions.
Okay.
yeah, you have to use
just be aware of that.
You use the chat function. That's why this meeting was so interesting, because we could have instant access to Grover. Okay, everybody, thanks for coming, and we'll see you down the road. We don't have a program yet for next month, but if you have an idea, give me a call. And does everybody know what geothermal is? We might have a program on geothermal cooling and heating of the church. How's that sound? It's only $500,000, but okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.